Again, whoop, there we go. Riveting, I know, riveting. When you keep it in its narrative, it makes a little more sense. But before we dive into the narrative of what this passage is talking about, where the ark is coming back into the city of Jerusalem and David is getting his groove on, there's some narrative things that are happening in there we're going to dive into. But before, I want to know, has anyone ever been to Central Park in New York City? We got 2, 3 people. Four. I've never been there because I don't like groups of people that are more than 3 million. So I get a little nervous. I drove to Chicago and I had to drive around in Chicago, and I didn't enjoy driving around in Chicago because there's more than millions of people there. And we parked at Soldier Field to go to some art museums. I love the culture there. There's some cool things. But we had to go down into the bunker. I don't know if you've ever been to Soldier Field in Chicago, but the parking structure is underground because there's no ground above ground. And it's like a skyscraper underneath. And I parked down there, and then we walked to the art museum. We had great fun there. We did the aquarium. It was great fun. And then we get back, and I got a little Aveo, It's like, at this time, it was a little Chevy Aveo. And, we're doing the going up and around, and all of a sudden I see light. It's like we're driving uphill and we see light. And I'm like, oh good, we're about to come out into the parking lot. That's not how that works. You come out, and all of a sudden, you're on the highway, and there's people blowing by you at 75 miles an hour. That's Chicago for you. So, that being said, I don't really feel like going to New York City, because that's just lots of people. I'm not a big fan. Lots of people and driving amongst them. They're just, I don't even like going to Metro Detroit anymore to drive around. That's a different story. But in Times Square in New York City, not Times Square, sorry, Central Park, there is an ancient Egyptian artifact. I don't know if you've seen it. I learned about it this week because I need to find cool stories that are going to connect Old Testament with modern 21st century peoples. And I'm like, okay, so we're having this thing about moving an ark and trying to get it to a place. I'm thinking to myself, I wonder what stories are out there. And I like historical ones, they're fun, or personal ones, because they're even more fun. But those are historical as well. But there is a needle, a standing stone Egyptian needle that is like 4,000 years old, that is put up in Central Park. I have a picture of it right here. There is a mirroring one in London, England. And these are called Cleopatra's needles. Cleopatra did not make them, by the way. She's the one that kind of transported them, not to New York, but she transported them to Alexandria. So these were Egyptian. These are ancient Egyptian architecture. How did they get in New York City and London? That's the question I wanted to know. How in the world are you going to get those things there, and why are they even there? Back in 1819, they were a gift to London and New York to settle a debt that Egypt had made to these modernized countries to help Egypt modernize itself. And so, how are we going to pay off this debt? Well, we got a whole bunch of really old things. So, in order to pay off this debt to America and Europe, or not Europe, UK, we're going to gift them these needles. They're called Cleopatra's needles. They're really old. They're just worth a lot of money. The problem is, how do you transport these humongous stone structures across oceans and seas to get them to the places that they've been gifted to? So what actually ended up happening is they remained unmoved till 1878. So they now, America and Europe, UK, sorry, they now own these stone Egyptian needles. But they didn't know, how are we going to transport this thing over here? It's like 200 and some thousand tons of stone. How are you going to transport that from one place to another? You can't just pop it on a truck and get it over here. That's just not going to happen, especially in the 1800s when they didn't have trucks, you know? Okay? Big horse, you got to pull it with a big horse. That's going to leave a trail behind you, right? So how are they going to move this thing? So this guy, there he is. That's a picture of him. He's missing the bottom part of his beard. I don't know what that's all about. He had an idea. John Dixon says they got a plan for a 92-foot iron pontoon boat. And so he commissioned, you can see the picture on this side over here. That's an actual picture of like what he envisioned in his head. How are we going to transport this one needle from where it's at all the way across the Mediterranean Sea and the English Channel to get it to London? And he said iron pontoon. So he built this humongous 92-foot iron pontoon, encased the 200-ton stone needle inside of it, and then put a deck on top of the pontoon boat, and then put a sail on top of that. And he's like, this is the key right here. This is going to work. And so they set sail. They set sail and they took off, and they hit a storm. Can you imagine? I've never been out at sea in a storm because I don't want to be. So I dodged the sea. Some of you, maybe you were in the Navy and you're like, I like boats. I don't like boats because what if the boat goes down? What are you going to stand on? Have you ever been in a boat and you're just thinking to yourself, there's like 2 inches of wood between me and the bottom of nothing. Like I was in Panama, and we had to take this 22-foot canoe to another island. And I really think about how you're going to transport this thing. Now, today's passage in our Bibles is about a story about they're transporting the Ark of the Covenant. That's a pretty fancy word. The Ark of the Covenant. I actually found this picture of what the Ark of the Covenant would look like. Yeah, and Indiana Jones was after this thing. I'm a childhood hero right there. You remember when the Nazis opened it at the end and they all got their faces melted? It actually happened in the Bible. When some people had the ark. Remember, it was stolen. First off, it was stolen by the Philistines. Way back in chapter 6, when we were looking through 1 Samuel, it was stolen, and the guys came back. He says, how was the war? He comes up to Eli, and he says, how's the war going? And he said, well, your sons died, and the ark of God was stolen. And then he had a heart attack, fell over, and died right there. So they had it stolen for a long time. It was recovered. The ark was recovered. Not because Harrison Ford recovered it back in the day, but it was recovered and it stayed in this place. You know how it was recovered? The Philistines had this ark, and they had it was like underneath this big statue of one of their gods, and it kept falling over and bowing before it. And finally, the third time it fell over, bowed before it, and it just kind of shattered. Its hands and feet fell off and everything. And so they said, oh, we got a problem here. And then they came down with the bubonic plague, the Philistines. So they're like, oh, we have this ark of God, and now we have the bubonic plague because we stole their holy relic. And so they became plagued. They think it was the bubonic plague. It was transmission by rats, and they had a lot of tumors. So what they decided to do, the Philistines, to give it back, like, we don't want to touch this thing, they put it on an ox cart, and then they just kind of like slap the ox in the butt, and they're like, just go, see what happens. But they also included, this is the funniest thing in the Bible, golden tumors as a way of saying, sorry, God, we stole your holy relic from your people. So they said, we're going to return this thing, and as a way of an extra, we're sorry, we're going to put golden tumors on this thing. So they put in golden tumors on the cart, and they just slapped the butt of the ox, and they're like, wherever it goes, it goes. And the ox then like made its way all the way back to this city, and it just kind of stayed there. And yeah, so some people looked inside of it, their faces melted, just like in there. So that is, they were Raiders of the Lost Ark at this point, because the ark is lost. And it's been at this place this other city elsewhere. Now, if you remember last week, David became king. Saul's son was assassinated. David becomes king over all of Israel, and then he goes and takes over the city of Jerusalem and makes it the capital. So he's kind of synthesized all of the different tribes into one people and one nation, and he's got his capital. And I was like, all right, now we got to set this thing up. We need this ark of God. Why does he want the ark? Like, what is so special about this piece? This was something that God told Moses to make, and then put the 10 Commandments inside of it. So the commandments were kind of like carved out of stone. And then he told everyone, like, how you're supposed to carry it is you need to put it on your shoulders on these poles, and you got to walk it. Like, I don't want this thing to be like luggage. I don't want this thing to be like, this is a holy thing, and only priests can touch it, and you got to put it on your shoulder, and you walk it. And they wandered around the wilderness with this ark thing for like 40 years with the law of God inside of it. And it was said that it had like these magical properties. So when they're finally done wandering the wilderness for 40 years, they're like, okay, it's time to go and receive the promised land. And Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho kind of thing. They had to cross the Jordan River. And so God told them, well, step into the river with the ark first, and it will dry up the riverbed. Kind of like Moses crossing the Red Sea, except in a river. Now, if you've ever seen the Jordan in the springtime, you don't want to step into a river because it's like raging and you'll get swept away. So these priests take the ark, they step into the water. As soon as their feet hit the water, the narrative tells us that that just dried up. The whole river Jordan dried up and everyone crossed on over. And then they walked the ark around Jericho 7 times for 7 days each, and the walls fell over and they were able to take over the city. So this is a part of their history. This is a part of their heritage. It's a part of their legacy. It's like their national treasure, giving them a religious identity and retaining their national story. Where did we come from? How did we get here? And what role did God play in us getting to this place? This is an important piece of their history. It's kind of like the Liberty Bell almost for us, like one of those relics kind of a thing. But it's a lot more like holy. It is made of acacia wood and gold. And it's said that you're supposed to carry it on your shoulders. So David's like, all right, I'm going to take this piece that is like God's presence is said to be there. And when they make sacrifice and they take blood, they got to sprinkle it where where those wings touch. They got to sprinkle blood where those wings are touched. And God is said to forgive the sins of the people in that moment on Yom Kippur when it happens. So this is an important piece of religious identity. It gives them a religious identity, a national treasure. It's a big deal. And so David says that piece that has led us through the wilderness, that has shaped us and has formed us and has provided for us and is a symbol of God's presence with us and is a center of all of our religious practice, that's got to come to where we're all centralized now. That's got to come from that house of Abinadab, and I got to bring it on over to Jerusalem. I want it here. And so, he has some drivers and dancers that's going to get us there. How do you transport something of such high value? Well, God told them how to transport it. You have to have a priest carry it by its poles. And David didn't listen to that part. He put it on an ox cart. And then he didn't just slap it in the butt and say, go where you go. He says, I'm going to give you a driver. And we're going to take God where we want to bring God. And all of a sudden they become now in control. So this is a part of the narrative. So I found some ancient holy icons of artwork that we can kind of see what this might look like with Legos. You know that there is an entire online Lego illustration of the Bible, just so you know, that exists, and this is a part of that. So here they put the ark on top of this cart, and they get 2 oxen, and the one guy, Ahio, he's like, I'm gonna take this. We have a plan and a purpose. This is where we're bringing it. This is where it's gonna go, and we're gonna get it to Jerusalem. And then there's Uzzah. Uzzah, I think that's how you pronounce his name. All right, confidently. Shh. Uzzah. Yeah, Uzzah is kind of like just walking on his side. So it says that they're coming, they're like walking down the road. David's got his groove on, and everyone's kind of singing and rejoicing, and they're making sacrifices along the way. And it says that when they got to this city, the bulls or the oxen, they tripped. I don't know if, like, I've never seen a cow trip before. Have you? I've seen a cow tip before. I've never seen one trip. But anyways, the cows tripped over the threshing floor. It's like a curd to keep the wheat inside of it, and they like stomp on the wheat because that's how they get the wheat out of the chaff, and then they throw it in the air, and the wind blows the chaff away, and then so it's an important place. Well, they're just walking, and the bulls trip, and the ark of God is gonna fall, and so Uzzah, he's like, I got this, bro. Ahiah was his brother, and he's like, I got it, and he pushes the ark back onto the cart, and it says in that moment that God struck him dead for touching the ark. It's like, I don't know how that happened, but that's what God was like, bam, you did. And Uzzah just died right there, and everyone's like, oh, wow. And it says that David got mad at God for that moment. This is a really interesting passage. Now again, Old Testament stuff is weird, it's really old, and we have to try and bring it into the modern day. Like, Indiana Jones people, like, they carried that, they didn't die, but they opened it and then their faces melted. But if it was here, like if the Ark of God was actually here and you touched it, would you be struck dead? Like that, those are questions that modern people are reading into this. Like we're almost reading like a history book. Like, let me give you all the facts of how everything happened. That's not why these stories were written. The stories were not written just to tell you, here's how it happened, just as I saw it. I'm a historian trying to chronicle everything as best as I could. They're attempting to answer questions. One of the questions that they're trying to answer with these narratives is these are kind of like stories that are passed on around firesides. It's called oral tradition. And then somebody decided to write it down later. Why'd they write it down? Well, later in Israel's history, 500 years later, they're going to be attacked by the Babylonians and overtaken. And they're not going to own their land, they're not going to own their city, they're not going to own all this stuff. And they're going to have a lot of questions about their faith and about God. They're going to enter into like this deconstruction phase of like, wait, what is even real? I thought we had all these stories. We had all these stories about what God was like and how God delivered us in this mode, in this mode. How come it didn't work this time? How come we're like sitting here with these Babylonians as our rulers oppressing us? And where is God in all this? Why did it happen? So they have this question of why didn't God rescue us? Why are we here? Where is God? What is God up to? And they start telling stories. One of the stories is this one. And so it's not necessarily this is how God works and this is what it's up to. And like, let me give you a history lesson about where we came from. It's more of like, well, where did we mess up? As a people, obviously we must have messed up or else we would be doing great right now. That's their minds. They're thinking that. So they're in Babylon, totally overtaken by the Babylonians, and they're questioning, where is God? Why isn't God rescuing us? Where are we? What is even going on? They have these questions. And so they center a religious practice and story and narrative around trying to answer these questions. And a lot of the Old Testament was compiled and edited in that space, in that time zone, where they're asking all these questions. And I say, well, let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story. I was like, oh, we got to write this down. We got to capture these stories. The question is, why are we here? And one of the answers was there was a failure in our religion. Our religion, we failed our religion because we were asked to do specific things. We didn't adhere to them, and now we're in this zone. And this story is kind of like telling a narrative about where we messed up as a people. And see, Uzzah is a figure. He's supposed to be like this priestly figure, but he's doing it all wrong. Because God said, if you're going to transport the ark, there's poles for that, and you got to walk. You got to put it on your shoulder, and you just got to go. And Uzzah didn't do that. David didn't do that. They put it on an ox cart, treated it like luggage, and then decided, we're going to take this thing where we want to take it. We're going to bring it where we want to bring it. We're in charge here, and we have a driver, and we're going to bring it to where it's got to go. That whole mindset of trying to control God, of trying to take God where you want to take God, and not being a person of faith and saying, God, where are we going? That is supposed to be contrasted with what the Philistines did. The Philistines were not the people of God. They worshiped this god called Dagon. But they had more faith than the people of God in this moment, because they just put the ark on this cart. They had no, here's how to handle this valuable piece of stuff. And they just slapped the ox on the butt and they said, it's up to God now. We have faith that this thing's going to go where it needs to go. And now we have the people of God, who are supposed to be the people of faith. They're like, we are the drivers. We're in the driver's seat and we're going to take this where we want to. So there's a failure here in their religion and the priests and the leaders of their religion. So one of the answers to why are we here in Babylon and God hasn't come to rescue us and give us back our land, one of the answers was, well, we kind of messed up back in the day, and now we're here. We've messed up. Our religion was supposed to be about this, and faith and trust, and is not. We decided to take God where we wanted to take God, and tell God where God ought to go and what God ought to be doing. And that is something we're supposed to pull out of the narrative as a gem. There's a lot of weird stuff that happens in the passage. I don't think God strikes people dead personally, because that is just not according to the revelation that Christ is in the New Testament. But one thing we got to pull out of this passage is the importance of faith in people and the people of God. The importance of letting God take us where we are, and trusting in this God is going to take us where we need to go. And we have a role in that. But why are we in this place? All the religious leaders are like, well, we kind of messed up. And then there's a leadership failure. David, the king, was supposed to be someone familiar with how to transport this valuable piece of furniture, right? This is like grandma's cedar chest, except times 1,000 more important. It's not just filled with grandma's pictures of all the family history. This is like their entire national 500-year history with the holy relics of the 10 Commandments inside of it. David should have been thinking, well, how does God say that we should be transporting this thing? But David didn't think that. He says, well, the Philistines did it this way. Let's do it that way too. The people of that religion, that faith, that people, it worked for them. I guess it'll work for us too. We'll just put it on an ox cart, except we're going to take it where we want to go. So he was kind of copying the way the Philistines transported the ark. And so this moment of being struck dead is kind of a decisive, y'all messed up in this moment kind of a story. Right? God doesn't actually strike people dead. But in this story, there's a statement made about this. We did this part wrong. We didn't have faith. We didn't have trust. We decided to do it our way, to figure out how to get this thing done and take it where we want to go, and not consult God and not do it the way that God has asked us to do it. And there was a decisive, y'all messed up moment that's communicated to the people in this moment of being struck down, struck dead. So that's kind of the point. God does not strike people dead. That's not up to God. Death just happens to people. But then we have David. He's can't stop, won't stop. He's I'm going to be dancing in front of this thing the whole time. And so he decides, okay, we did it wrong the first time. Let's not do that the second time around. They correct themselves. They start carrying it properly. And then David is dancing in front of it. He's wearing a linen ephod, it says, which is a priestly garment. He's the king. But he also starts taking up this priestly role. And then he starts sacrificing bulls along the way. That was a big thing in ancient days, was you just kill animals and throw their blood around, and everything's all good. We don't do that anymore. Well, I hope not. Don't kill animals and throw their blood around. But this here is a moment where David is let's make it right. Let's go back and do it the way that God said. And so they start carrying it, and here's an actual picture of David getting his groove on. Right there. That's a painting. He is just dancing in front of this thing with all his might, and then he's sacrificing bulls as he goes to try and get this ark to the place where it has to go. Now he takes up the role of the priest. Now what's interesting is David, the king, takes the role of the priest and offers sacrifices to God. happened the last time a king did that? Saul. Y'all remember that story a couple months ago? Saul was like, we're about to go into battle. Samuel's not here to offer the sacrifice. What do? I'll take up the priestly role. I'll sacrifice this bull right here. There, get it. He turns around, there's Samuel. And Samuel's like, oh man, you done messed up, Saul. Like, you are now in trouble. God has rejected you and the king and your kingship. And it took a couple of decades for David to then get into the role of king. But you know what question I had? How come David can do it and Saul can't? That one really puzzled me. Because here David is wearing priestly garments and he's offering priestly sacrifices. And Saul did the same thing and was rejected as king. But somehow David does it and it's okay. What's the difference? That's what I was thinking. What is the difference? I think humility was the difference. David learned from the mistakes that he made and decided to change it and make it right. Whereas Saul did not learn from his mistakes. Saul did it from a place of impatience. Saul did it from a place of, well, I'm just going to get this done because this is how it needs to be done and Samuel's not here to do it. David, on the other hand, is doing it from a different place altogether. He's standing on the grounds of humility. And he's dancing like three-quarter naked in the streets. And there is a really, really funny biblical quote that I want to just share with you. David's wife, Michal, who was was the wife of Saul, saw him dancing in the streets. And she's like, you just totally made a fool of yourself out there, David. Good job. Like, you're dancing. I don't know if you can see, like, there's some flaps there. What is going to happen to those flaps? You start spinning, dancing, and jumping? Yeah, you're going to be exposing some things, right? And Michal accused David of dancing like this, and all the young maidens she's like, you just exposed yourself in front of all these young maidens. David has a response. I don't think there's a lot of humility in the response, but I think it's hilarious, regardless. And it's one of those, like, oh my gosh, he just owned the moment. It says this: it was before the Lord who chose me in place of your father and all his household to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord. I will dance before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be humbled in my own eyes. But by the maids of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. All the guys are laughing right now. That's in the Bible, y'all. The ladies will remember what I did today. That's what he said. Y'all are giggling too. So it's not just me that found this funny. Okay, good. I thought that was hilarious. Okay, back to humility. The point of this passage is David is a humble king. I don't think that was a very humble statement, but that doesn't contain the entirety of what David was talking about. But humility is something that Saul did not have. He's like, well, I'm the king. I'm going to get everything done. And David has like this God-first mentality to him. It's not about him and his appearance and his ego. He says, I will dance in front of everyone. It doesn't matter what it looks like. I'll make myself a fool. Because he's thinking of God. He's thinking of getting this holy relic to the place where it can be properly worshipped, properly maintained. And it becomes like a place of worship for the next 500 years. It'll be the center. It'll go in the middle of the Holy of Holies in the temple. The priest will go in there and offer sacrifice and sprinkle the blood on what's called the mercy seat, which is the place where the wings touch, and make atonement for all the people of God. The interesting thing is this ark disappears. And after the Babylonians come in, we don't ever hear of the ark again. We don't know where it went. That's kind of the basis of it. Where did the ark go? Where did it end up? Who has it? Was it ever real in the first place, or was it all mythology and lore? Where did it end up? Where did it go? We don't know. Some people say the Babylonians took it, and it's one of their treasures, and then lost it or destroyed it. Some people think that it was hidden from them and like buried in an underground cave, and we don't know where it went at all. But it was buried and hidden from them. Some people say it was just destroyed when the Romans came. But in the time of Jesus, there's no ark in the Holy of Holies. Nothing's happening in there. And what the Greeks do, right before, 100 years before Christ is born, the Greeks come and take over, and they put a statue of Zeus where the ark should be, and they slaughters a pig in that moment, in there, like the most desecrating thing that could happen in their religious life happened in that moment. And they all thought God was going to strike him dead, and it didn't happen. So then they're questioning their faith again, like, well, how much of this is valid? But then Jesus, when he dies, the temple curtain is ripped in half, exposing the emptiness of the Holy of Holies, saying, God was never contained in here. God wasn't in here. Like, it was an important place, and it was a center for religious activity, but God is now found amongst the people. God inhabits the people, and where 2 or 3 or more are gathered, that's where the presence of God comes around. And we have to be a people of humility and trust and faith and love, aiming all of that towards justice for people. Like, that's what it is all about. David captures a lot of that. Doesn't do it perfectly, but he captures a lot of that in his kingship that Saul didn't have. And so humility is like this piece that is the crowning virtue of all of the virtues that you could get. They're all built upon humility. Because if you don't have humility, the other virtues cannot be instilled into you, or you'll be really proud that you got this virtue that someone else over there didn't get. And so humility is like the most important virtue that anyone can ever instill in themselves, because all the other virtues are going to be built on it. My homeboy Thomas Burton, he said this: pride makes us artificial, and humility makes us real. True humility excludes self-contempt. The truly humble man does not care one way or the other about himself or about the way other people regard him. Oh, that's humble right there. When you just don't care about opinions of people, but you really care about the people themselves and loving people, humility is there. Because if you take everything personally, and everything is like a shot to you, you think, well, I'm not a prideful person because I take everything personally. It's actually the opposite side of the coin of pride, because you have an expectation that you ought to be perfect, that you ought to be those things that make prideful people prideful, but you can't quite achieve it. And so you have this self-contempt for yourself. And Thomas Merton says humility doesn't have self-contempt. Humility has no thoughts about self, really. You just think about yourself less. You think about others more. And so this is a place where we can kind of think about, how do I infuse humility into my existence? You don't have to be perfect, by the way. You don't have to have it down. So I got a few questions here. Do I have self-contempt, revealing an expectation of self-inflation? Am I down on myself and criticize myself and beat up myself all the time? That shows that you ought to be, like, you're thinking, I ought to be perfect, I ought to be amazing, I ought to be awesome, which is the reverse side of pride. Do I self-inflate, revealing a deep insecurity in my ability to be real? Do I hide who I really am with this self-inflated, confident something that's thrown out there? That's not humility either. If humility wears no mask, then who am I? That was a good question that I was pondering this week. And if the real I was revealed, how different would it be than the I present to the world? See, the less difference there is, the more humble you are. That's the thing. The less difference there is between the I you are and the I you present to people, the more humble you are, the more authentic you are. Humility does that. So, Psalm 24 is our benediction today from Malcolm Guite. It says this: and draw me into his eternity, but who can rise up to that holy place? Can all its splendors really be for me? Before that holy fire I hide my face, my hands were never clean. As for my heart, he'll search out its impurity and trace the source of its sin in every part. And in the whole, its weariness and stain. Who can ascend? I cannot even start, but even as I fear, my hopes are vain. My Savior comes. His love revives my hope. I feel him search my wounds, deal with my pain, and offer me again the healing cup. Raising my head, he says, now rise with me. The gates will open for us both. Look up. Psalm 24, retold by Malcolm Guite.